In the fall of 2022, a mining firm that holds mineral rights to over 7,000 acres of subsurface land beneath the Twain National Forest in Reynolds County, Missouri, deployed a four-man survey crew into the ridgelines northeast of Centerville to conduct a geophysical assessment of a potential lead and zinc deposit. The crew carried magnetometers, GPS units, and a portable thermal imaging system used to identify geological faults by measuring ground surface temperature differentials. On the third night of fieldwork, the thermal unit recorded something that had nothing to do with geology. Two large heat signatures, upright, bipedal, moving along a ridgeline above the survey camp at a speed and with a coordination that the crew leader, a man with 19 years in mineral exploration, could not reconcile with any animal he had ever encountered in the Missouri Ozarks. The signatures were consistent in body temperature with a large mammal, but the posture, the height relative to the surrounding hardwoods, and the unmistakable canine profile visible in the thermal rendering placed this recording squarely into territory that the mining industry, the Forest Service, and the state of Missouri have no interest in acknowledging. What the crew documented over the following week in those ridgelines matches a pattern of dogman activity that has been reported across the Ozark Plateau for over a century, and the company that sent them there has not allowed a survey team past that ridge since. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The man who led that survey crew asked us not to use his real name, given that the company he worked for is still active in the Viburnum Trend mining district, and given what happened to his career after he submitted his field report, that request makes sense. We will call him Merle. Merle grew up in Dent County, Missouri, about 20 miles north of the Reynolds County line, in one of those small Ozark communities that exists because the timber and the mining existed first, and the family stayed after both industries contracted. His grandfather worked underground in the old lead belt around Flat River and Bonne Terre in the 50s and 60s. His father drove truck for a gravel operation near Salem. Merle went to Missouri S&T in Rolla, which at the time most people still called Rolla School of Mines, and earned a degree in geological engineering in the late 90s. He had been walking those ridgelines since he was old enough to follow his father into the woods, and by the time he finished his degree, he knew the karst terrain of the eastern Ozarks the way a river guide knows current. After college, he went to work for a mineral exploration company based out of St. Louis that held federal leases along the Viburnum Trend. The Trend is a 50-mile band of lead, zinc, and copper deposits running roughly north to south through Iron, Reynolds, Shannon, and Dent counties, cutting directly through the Twain National Forest. Mining companies have operated underground along the Trend since the early 1960s, and the relationship between the Forest Service and the mining interests is one of those arrangements that most people in Missouri know about without fully understanding. The federal government owns the surface. The trees, the trails, the campgrounds, the rivers, those belong to the Forest Service and by extension to the public. But the mineral rights underneath belong to whoever bought them or leased them, which in many cases means private companies that have been pulling lead out of the Bonne Terre Formation for over half a century. You can hike the Ozark Trail through a section of the Salem Ranger District, pitch your tent, listen to the whippoorwills, and never know that 1,200 feet below your sleeping bag, a mining operation is boring into dolomite that formed 450 million years ago. Merle spent the first decade of his career running survey crews along the Trend, mapping geological structures and identifying where ore bodies extended beyond existing mine footprints. He could read a magnetometer output and a topo map with equal fluency, and he could spend a week in the backcountry carrying 40 pounds of equipment without complaint. By 2010, he had moved to a smaller firm that held mineral rights to several thousand acres in the southeastern part of Reynolds County, where the Viburnum Trend bends toward the current river drainage. The terrain there is steep and heavily forested, cut by hollows that drop 300 feet in a quarter mile, choked with post oak, white oak, black oak, and hickory on the ridgetops and eastern red cedar in the glades. The understory is dense. Greenbrier and sassafras and sumac grow so thick in places that moving through the brush feels like pushing through a wall. The ground is dolomite and chert, pocked with sinkholes and caves that riddle the bedrock like wormholes in old wood. Missouri has over 6,000 documented caves, and a significant number of them are in Reynolds and Shannon counties. The karst topography means the landscape is deceptive. What looks like solid ridgeline from above can be hollow underneath, and the caves and sinkholes and springs create a subterranean network that nobody has fully mapped. The ridgeline that matters in this story runs roughly east to west about 4 miles northeast of Centerville, paralleling a section of Route 72 before the road drops down toward Ellington. The ridge separates two drainages, both of which feed into the West Fork of the Black River. On the south side of the ridge, the terrain rolls downhill through mixed hardwoods toward a series of spring-fed hollows that stay wet year-round. On the north side, the slope drops steeply into a narrow valley where the forest gets old and thick, and the canopy closes overhead so completely that walking through it at midday feels like dusk. The company's mineral rights extended under both sides of the ridge and about 2 miles north into the valley. Merle had surveyed the Sowitel side multiple times over the years without incident. The north side is where everything changed. Merle was married by then. His wife worked for the school system in Salem. They had a house on a few acres outside of town, close enough to the forest that deer came into the yard most evenings and turkeys roosted in the oaks along the property line. He was in his early 40s, comfortable in his career, respected by the people he worked with, and carrying the kind of quiet confidence that comes from doing technical work in rough terrain for the better part of 2 decades without making a mistake that hurt anyone. He was not a man who jumped at shadows or told stories around a campfire that grew in the telling. He kept notes. He measured things. He documented. Those habits would matter. The 2022 survey was prompted by new assay results from a drilling program the company had run 2 years earlier on the south side of the ridge. The core samples showed elevated zinc concentrations in the Bonneterre dolomite at depths consistent with the viburnum trend mineralization pattern, and the company's geologists wanted a surface geophysical survey to map the fault structures on the north side before committing to a north side drilling program. Drilling is expensive. You do not punch holes in dolomite at 1,200 feet of depth unless your surface data tells you where to aim. That was Merle's job. Map the faults, measure the magnetic anomalies, identify the structures that might control ore deposition, and give the geologists enough data to place their drill targets. He put together a crew of 3, plus himself. One was a geophysicist from the St. Louis office, a woman with a master's degree from Rolla, who had worked with Merle on previous surveys. One was a field technician, a younger man Merle had hired out of college 3 years earlier who was steady and reliable in the backcountry. The third was a local, a man we will call Doyle, who had spent the better part of 40 years working various jobs in the Reynolds County woods. Logging, fencing, brush clearing, occasional work for the Forest Service on trail maintenance. Doyle was not a trained geologist. He was the guy who knew every logging road, every creek crossing, every ridgeline trail, and every property boundary in the eastern half of Reynolds County because he had walked them all multiple times over 4 decades. Survey crews in rough terrain need someone like Doyle, someone who can get a truck up a grade that does not look drivable, who knows where the ground will hold weight and where it will not, who can find a route through a hollow that a GPS says is impassable. Doyle had done contract work for the company before and had been specifically requested by Merle for this survey. They mobilized on a Monday in mid-October. The plan was a 10-day survey, 5 days on the south side of the ridge to calibrate against known geology, then 5 days on the north side to map new ground. Base camp was a wide spot on a Forest Service road about 2 miles from the ridge. Merle's truck, Doyle's truck, and a utility trailer with instruments and supplies. The geophysicist and the field tech drove in from Salem each morning and left each evening. Merle and Doyle stayed at camp. The first 5 days on the south side went according to plan. Clear and cool October weather, high 40s at night and mid-60s during the day. The forest was turning. Red and gold on the oaks, the hickories going yellow, the cedars staying dark in the glades. On Tuesday of the first week, Doyle mentioned something to Merle that Merle did not think much of at the time. Doyle said, the woods on the north side of the ridge were quiet. Doyle had walked up to the ridgeline that afternoon to scout access routes for the following week, and he said the north slope was wrong. He could not say exactly how. The timber was the same, the terrain was the same, but the usual noise of the forest was absent. No turkeys calling, no squirrels working the oaks, no woodpeckers hammering in the snags. Doyle said he had been in quiet woods before, usually after a big storm or during an extreme cold snap, when the animals hunker down and wait. This was different. The weather was mild. The conditions should have produced an active forest. Instead, the north slope was still. Merle said something about the deer probably being concentrated in the bottoms near water, which was true and reasonable. Doyle nodded but did not look convinced. He stood at the tailgate of his truck that evening, drinking coffee from a thermos and looking up toward the ridgeline with an expression Merle had not seen on Doyle's face before. Doyle had been in those woods longer than Merle had been alive. If the forest felt wrong to Doyle, that meant something. Merle just did not know what it meant yet. They moved to the north side on Monday of the second week. The access route took them up an old logging trace that Doyle had cleared of deadfall with a chainsaw, crossed the ridge through a saddle, and dropped down the north side on switchbacks washed out to bare chert and dolomite rubble. Doyle's mid-90s Ford with oversized tires handled it. Merle's Ram scraped bottom twice before they reached the north slope. The north side was everything Doyle had described. Old-growth character in places, with white oaks and red oaks over 150 years old. The canopy closed so completely that GPS units had trouble acquiring satellites. The terrain was steep and broken, with limestone ledges along the contour lines and sinkholes scattered through the hollows, one of them over 60 feet across and at least 30 deep. The dolomite bedrock was exposed in patches, gray and fractured, streaked with iron staining that told Merle the faults he was looking for were close. The silence was pervasive. Merle registered it within the first hour. The wind moved through the canopy above, but below it, in the understory where the crew was working, the forest was still in a way that felt deliberate. They ran their first transect lines on Monday afternoon. Standard magnetometer survey, walking parallel lines at 25-meter intervals across the slope, recording measurements at fixed stations. The work was slow because the terrain was rough and the GPS signal was intermittent under the canopy. By late afternoon, they had completed 4 transect lines, and the data was showing promising magnetic anomalies that suggested a fault structure running northeast to southwest, exactly the orientation the geologists had predicted. Merle was focused on the data. The silence in the background had become normalized. You stop hearing what is absent after a few hours. Your brain fills in the expected sounds, and the absence becomes invisible. Monday night, Merle and Doyle were at base camp on the Forest Service Road. The geophysicist and the field tech had driven back to Salem. Merle was working on his laptop in the cab of his truck with the dome light on. Doyle was in the bed of his Ford under the camper shell, reading. Sometime around 9:30, Doyle knocked on Merle's window. Merle rolled it down. Doyle was standing outside the truck in the dark, and the first thing Merle noticed was that Doyle was holding his deer rifle, a lever action in 30-30 that Doyle kept behind the seat of his truck. Doyle did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Listen." Merle killed the dome light and listened. At first, he heard what he expected, wind in the oaks, the tick of his engine cooling, a distant sound that might have been a truck on Route 72, 2 miles south. Then he heard it, a vocalization coming from the direction of the ridge, north of camp, from somewhere on the north slope, low frequency, deep enough that Merle felt it before he consciously identified it as sound. The tone was steady, not pulsing or rhythmic, but sustained, like a note held on an instrument too large to be real. It lasted maybe 4 or 5 seconds, then dropped off. Silence. Then it came again, from a different position, further east, along the ridge. The same low tone, same duration, but at a slightly different pitch, a variation on the same sound, produced by a different source. Doyle looked at Merle in the dark. Merle could see his eyes but not his expression. Doyle said, "That is not a coyote." Merle agreed. He had heard coyotes his entire life. Coyotes yip and howl, and the sound carries a sharp, almost musical quality that is unmistakable once you know it. What he was hearing had no similarity to coyotes. It had no similarity to anything in his experience. Doyle said it was not an elk either, and Merle almost said there are no elk in Reynolds County, but he stopped himself because he realized Doyle was not identifying species. He was eliminating them. Doyle knew every sound these woods made. He was running through the catalog in his head and coming up empty. The vocalization came a third time, same low frequency, same sustained tone, but this time from behind them, south of camp. Between them and Route 72, Merle felt something cold move through his stomach that had nothing to do with the October night air. The first 2 sounds had come from the ridge, north of their position. This one came from the south. Whatever was making the sound was not a single animal calling from a fixed position. There were at least 2 sources, and they were positioned on opposite sides of the camp. Doyle did not say anything. He got into Merle's truck, set the rifle across his knees, and the two of them sat there with the windows up for the next 40 minutes. The sounds did not come again. The forest settled into ordinary night noise. An owl called from somewhere on the ridge. A coyote pack started up far to the west, their familiar yipping a strange comfort after what had preceded it. Merle and Doyle did not discuss what they had heard. They sat in the truck and waited for the silence to become normal again, and eventually it did, and eventually Doyle went back to his truck and Merle tried to sleep and did not sleep well. In the morning, Merle walked the perimeter of the camp before the other two crew members arrived from Salem. He was not sure what he was looking for. He found it anyway. In the soft shoulder of the Forest Service road, about 40 yards south of where the trucks were parked, there were tracks in the clay soil that the previous day's rain had softened. Canid tracks. Large. Merle was a geologist, not a wildlife biologist, but he had spent enough time in the Ozark backcountry to know what a coyote track looked like, and these were not coyote tracks. The pad impressions were broad, over 4 inches across, with 4 distinct toe marks and visible claw punctures at the front. The stride between tracks was long, well over 3 feet, and the tracks ran in a straight line along the road shoulder for about 30 feet before turning off into the timber on the south side. Merle measured them with the tape from his field kit, 4¼ inches wide, 5 inches long. He photographed them with his phone, shooting 3 frames with a pencil laid beside the clearest track for scale. He showed the photographs to Doyle when Doyle walked over with coffee. Doyle looked at the images on the phone screen for a long time. Then he crouched down and looked at the actual tracks in the road shoulder. He measured the stride himself, pacing it off with his boots. He looked at the direction the tracks led, into the timber south of camp, toward Route 72. Then he stood up and said something that Merle told me he has replayed in his mind hundreds of times since. Doyle said his mother used to tell him there were things in the deep hollows that did not have a name anybody used out loud. He said she grew up on a farm outside Ellington, and the old people in that community, the families that had been in Reynolds County since before the Civil War, had a way of talking about certain parts of the forest that was not about bears or panthers or any animal you could look up in a book. He said they called them ridge walkers, and that was as much as anyone would say about it, and that the conversation always ended there. Doyle said his mother told him once that you could hear them at night if you were in the wrong hollow at the wrong time, and that the sound they made was low enough to feel in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Merle had never heard the word dogman at that point. He did not know the research or the history. He did not know that what Doyle's mother called a ridge walker matched descriptions from hundreds of independent witnesses across the continent who used a different word for the same thing. Merle stood there holding his phone with the track photographs on the screen and felt the ground shift under his assumptions about what he was doing on that ridge. He was a geologist. He measured things. He documented. He worked in the real world of rock and mineral and mathematical models. What Doyle was describing did not fit any of that, and what was in those tracks did not fit either, and the sound they had heard the night before sat in the gap between what Merle knew and what he did not want to consider. He did not report the tracks or the vocalizations to the company. There was no category for it. The firm's field safety protocol covered severe weather, equipment failure, vehicle accidents, encounters with venomous snakes, and aggressive wildlife, which in the Ozarks meant black bears and the occasional feral hog. There was no form for unidentified large canid tracks and infrasonic vocalizations from multiple positions around a survey camp. No checkbox on the daily field report for evidence suggesting an undocumented apex predator is monitoring your operation from both sides of a ridgeline. Merle wrote up his transect data, noted the weather conditions and equipment status, and said nothing about what had happened during the night. The report went to St. Ten. Louis, looking exactly the way every other daily field report he had ever submitted looked. Clean, professional, incomplete, in a way that nobody reading it would ever suspect. Tuesday and Wednesday on the north side produced good geological data. The fault structure was mapping clearly, the magnetic anomalies were well defined, and the survey was on schedule. The crew worked during daylight hours, starting each morning when the geophysicist and field tech arrived from Salem, and wrapping up by late afternoon when the light started to fail. Each evening the Salem crew left and Merle and Doyle stayed at camp. Each night was quiet, no vocalizations, no tracks in the morning. Merle began to think the Monday night sounds had been an anomaly, something rare and unexplainable that he could file in the back of his mind and not think about. On Wednesday evening, after the Salem crew had left, Merle decided to stay on the north side of the ridge an hour past sunset. He wanted to run one more magnetometer line across a section of the slope where the afternoon data had shown an anomaly he could not explain with the existing fault model. The anomaly was strong enough to suggest either a previously unmapped geological structure or interference from a metallic source near the surface, and he wanted to resolve it before the crew spent time the next day walking lines in the wrong direction. Doyle stayed with him. Merle asked if he was comfortable with it. Doyle looked up at the ridgeline, looked back at Merle, and said he would go, but he was bringing the 30-30. Merle did not argue. They hiked back to the anomaly site with headlamps and the magnetometer, arriving about 20 minutes after sundown. The trail was familiar from the afternoon, but the forest around it had changed. The Ozarks at night in October have a density to them that daylight erases. The shadows between the oaks filled in until the spaces between the trees were solid black, and the only world that existed was the narrow cone of light from the headlamps and the sound of their boots on the leaf litter. The forest on the north slope after dark was a different place than the forest they had been working in during the day. The canopy blocked what remained of the twilight almost completely. The headlamps carved narrow tunnels through the understory, illuminating 10 or 15 feet of trail and leaving everything else in blackness. The temperature dropped fast. Merle could see his breath. He set up the magnetometer at the first station and started recording. Doyle stood about 20 feet away, leaning against an oak, holding his rifle loosely and watching the darkness beyond the headlamp range. Merle was focused on the instrument. The readings were coming in strong, confirming the anomaly. He was thinking about fault geometry and bonitaire dolomite and ore deposition. He was not thinking about what was in the forest with them until Doyle said his name in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Merle looked up. Doyle was not leaning against the oak anymore. He was standing rigid, the rifle at a low, ready position, his headlamp pointed down at the ground the way you do when you do not want to broadcast your position. He was looking northeast, up the slope toward the ridgeline, about 60 yards through the timber. Merle killed his headlamp. In the sudden dark, he could see nothing. His eyes had been adapted to the instrument display, and the transition to blackness was total. He stood still and waited for his night vision to build. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and then, as shapes began to resolve in the ambient starlight filtering through gaps in the canopy, he saw what Doyle was looking at. Something was standing on the slope above them. Merle could not make out detail. What he could see was a shape, darker than the surrounding timber, vertical, tall, standing between two trees. He had walked past those trees earlier in the day, and he knew their spacing. Whatever was standing between them filled the gap. The shape was wider at the top than at the bottom, wide through the shoulders or the upper body, tapering downward, and it was tall. Merle's immediate reference was the oak trees. The surrounding white oaks had a canopy break at roughly 50 to 60 feet. The shape was standing well below the canopy, but its head, or what Merle perceived as its head, was at a height that he later estimated at 7.5 to 8 feet above the ground, based on the tree trunks it stood between. The head was wrong. He could not articulate how in the moment, but later, writing up his field notes, he described the silhouette of the head as elongated forward, with a muzzle profile that was canine rather than ursine, and pointed structures at the top that could have been ears standing erect. It was motionless, standing on the slope above them, looking down, and the steadiness of it was what made Merle's hands start shaking. A bear will shift its weight. A deer will flick its ears or stamp a foot. Whatever was on that slope above them held position with a stillness that suggested patience and purpose. It was watching them the way something watches when it has been watching for a long time and has decided that being seen is acceptable. Merle could hear Doyle breathing beside him, short and controlled, the way a man breathes when he is managing adrenaline through discipline rather than giving in to it. The October air was cold on Merle's face and his hands were wet, and the sweat had nothing to do with exertion. His headlamp hung around his neck, switched off, and he was grateful for the dark because the dark meant the thing on the slope could not see his hands trembling on the magnetometer cable. Doyle moved first. He reached over and put his hand on Merle's forearm. The grip was tight. Then he stepped backward, slowly, keeping his body oriented toward the shape on the slope. Merle followed. They backed down the trail they had come up, one step at a time, not running, not speaking, just moving away from whatever was above them with the careful, Measured retreat of two men who understood instinctively that running was wrong. Merle grabbed the magnetometer with one hand as they passed it, dragging it by the cable rather than stopping to properly secure it. The instrument case banged against rocks and roots. The noise was loud in the quiet forest, and the shape on the slope moved. It shifted position. A lateral movement, maybe 10 feet, smooth and fast, repositioning to maintain line of sight as they retreated downhill. The movement told Merle something his mind was not ready to accept. The shape was tracking them, adjusting its position to keep them in view. That was not prey behavior, and it was not curious animal behavior. That was the behavior of something maintaining visual contact on a subject that was trying to leave, the way a security officer tracks someone crossing a perimeter. They reached the logging trace where they had parked and got into Merle's truck. Merle started the engine, turned on the headlights, and drove back over the ridge to base camp on the Forest Service road. Neither of them spoke during the drive. Doyle held the 30-30 across his lap the entire way, safety off, looking out the passenger window into the timber on the north side as they climbed the switchbacks. When they reached camp, Merle parked and shut off the engine and sat there. His hands were shaking too badly to hold his phone. The adrenaline that had been sustaining controlled movement for the past 15 minutes was metabolizing into something that felt like seasickness. Doyle got out of the truck, walked to the back of his Ford, and sat on the tailgate. Merle could hear him breathing hard in the dark. They did not go back to the north side after dark again. But the survey was not done. 3 more days of transect data were needed to complete the mapping. And Merle had a contract, a professional obligation, and a reputation built on finishing what he started. So on Thursday morning, when the geophysicist and the field tech arrived from Salem, Merle told them about the vocalizations and the tracks, but not about the sighting. He framed it as a potential large predator, possibly a bear exhibiting unusual behavior, and said the crew should work together and stay within visual range of each other at all times. Standard protocol for working in areas with active bear or cougar activity. The geophysicist accepted this without question. The field tech looked at Doyle, who said nothing, and then looked at Merle, and Merle could tell the kid was reading something in Doyle's face that the official explanation did not cover. But the kid was professional. He picked up his equipment and went to work. Thursday and Friday produced the remaining transect data Merle needed. The geological picture was clear. A significant fault structure ran northeast to southwest through the north side of the ridge, and the magnetic data strongly suggested that the viburnum trend mineralization extended under the company's lease parcels in that area. The survey was a success from a technical standpoint. The company's geologists would have what they needed to plan a drilling program. Merle should have felt satisfied. Instead, he felt something he did not have a clean word for. He felt like he had taken something from a place that did not want to give it. On Thursday afternoon, while the crew was running the final transects on the north slope, the field tech found something that stopped the work for an hour. A tree, a post oak, maybe 10 inches in diameter, standing at the edge of a small glade about halfway down the north slope. The tree had been marked. Deep vertical gouges ran from about 4.5 feet above the ground to just over 7 feet. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and resinous. They were in groups of 4, spaced roughly 2.5 inches apart, each groove about 1/4 inch deep, cut through the bark and into the wood beneath with force that implied significant strength. The field tech called Merle over and asked what could do that. Merle looked at the marks. He measured the height, the spacing, the depth. Black bears mark trees. He knew that, but black bear claw marks in Missouri rarely go above 5.5 feet, and the spacing between individual claw grooves on a bear corresponds to the width of a bear's paw, which is about 1.5 inches. What he was looking at had wider spacing, greater height, and a grouping of 4 rather than the 5 marks a bear leaves. 4 claws, not 5, arranged like a hand, not a paw. Doyle stood behind Merle looking at the marked tree and said 2 words, "Ridgewalker." Then he walked back to the transect line and picked up his pack and kept working. That was the last time Doyle referenced the name his mother had used, and it was the last explanation anyone on the crew offered for what they were finding on the north side of the ridge. Friday evening, the last day of the survey, the crew packed out the equipment and drove back over the ridge for the final time. The geophysicist and the field tech left for Salem. Merle and Doyle spent one more night at base camp before breaking down and heading home on Saturday morning. Friday night was quiet. No vocalizations. No sounds from the ridge, but Merle lay awake in his truck for a long time, listening to the October wind in the oaks and thinking about what he was going to put in his field report. What he put in the field report was the geological data, the magnetometer survey, the fault mapping, the anomaly analysis, the drill target recommendations. It was thorough, professional, and complete in every respect related to the mineral exploration objectives of the survey. What he left out was everything else. The vocalizations, the tracks, the sighting on the north slope, the marked tree, Doyle's description of ridge walkers. None of it appeared in the report that went to the company's geology department in St. Louis. Merle filed it in a separate document on his personal laptop, along with the track photographs and a detailed written account of each incident, time-stamped and GPS tagged. He titled the file Northside Observations and saved it to an external drive that he kept at home. He told himself he was being responsible. He told himself the field report was for geological data and the personal file was for things he needed time to process. He told himself that reporting unexplained wildlife observations in an official company document would accomplish nothing except raising questions about his judgment at a time when the survey results were important for the company's investment decisions. All of that was true, and underneath all of it was the simpler truth that he did not know how to describe what he had seen on that slope in language that a geology report could contain without making him look like he had lost his professional composure in the field. The company received the geological report in early November and responded the way Merle expected. The data was strong. The fault structure on the north side of the ridge aligned with the viburnum trend mineralization model, and the magnetic anomalies suggested ore at depths and grades consistent with the producing mines further north along the trend. The geology department recommended a Phase 2 exploratory drilling program targeting 2 locations on the north slope, with mobilization planned for early spring of 2023. Merle was asked to lead the site preparation. He said yes. He spent the winter planning access routes and coordinating Forest Service permits. The drilling program would require road construction, a staging area, and heavy equipment on the north side of the ridge. Months of work, generators, drill rigs, core processing equipment, all of it in the timber on the north slope, where something had stood on the ridgeline and watched his survey crew retreat. In February of 2023, Merle drove out to the ridge alone. He sat in his truck on the ridgeline with binoculars and glassed the north slope for over an hour. The winter canopy was open, the understory visible in a way it never was during the growing season. He could see into the hollows for the first time, and what he saw changed his understanding of the terrain. 2 cave openings he had not noticed during the October survey, screened by limestone overhangs and cedar growth, large enough for something of significant size to enter and exit, and on the trees across the north slope, marks. He counted 7 bearing the same vertical gouges he had documented in October, fresh on some of them, pale wood exposed against gray bark, visible at 200 yards through 10 power glass. Whatever was on the north side had not moved on. It had been marking territory all winter. The thermal data from the October survey was the evidence that changed everything, and Merle did not examine it carefully until that winter. The crew's portable thermal imaging system was designed for identifying geological faults by measuring surface temperature differentials. It recorded continuously, storing thermal imagery alongside GPS coordinates. Merle had processed the geological data for his report, but the system also captured ambient thermal readings of the surrounding environment. Those readings sat unexamined on the data drive for months. In January, scrolling through the ambient thermal files at his home office, he found what the Wednesday evening session had captured. The thermal record showed what Merle's eyes had seen in the dark, but with infrared precision. 2 large heat signatures on the slope above the survey position. 2, not 1. Merle had seen 1 shape. The thermal data showed a second positioned about 20 feet away, screened behind a tree, invisible to direct observation but clearly present in the thermal record, both upright, both over 7 feet. Dense body heat through the torso, cooler at the extremities. Head profiles showing an elongated forward projection and 2 heat points at the top of the skull consistent with upright pointed ears. Merle had retreated from 1 shape in the dark. A second one had been right beside it the entire time. He also found 3 brief heat signature events from earlier that same afternoon, during the transect work. Large signatures appearing at 80 to 120 yards from the survey line, remaining stationary for 15 to 30 seconds, then moving out of the thermal field of view. The crew had been unaware. They were looking at instruments, focused on geology. This was not a lone animal. Multiple individuals, aware of the human presence, monitoring it from concealed positions during the day, closing distance at night. The coordinated positioning implied communication and planning. The behavior matched the territorial surveillance patterns that Dogman researchers have documented across the continent. If you have spent time in the Ozark backcountry anywhere in Reynolds, Shannon, or Dent counties, if you have hunted those ridgelines or camped in the hollows or floated the west fork of the Black River where it cuts through the forest between the old mining roads, you know the kind of terrain I am describing. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything unusual happen in those woods, because the reports I have been pulling together from that part of the Mark Twain go back a long time and cover a lot more ground than this one survey site. The Ozark Plateau has been inhabited for over 12,000 years. The Osage, who called themselves the Niukanska, the children of the Middle Waters, dominated this region for centuries before European contact, ranging across what the historian Lewis Houck described as the high plateaus and the deep valleys. Their cosmology described the world as a meeting place between the people of the sky and the people of the earth, and the Ozark landscape, with its caves dropping into the underworld and its ridgelines reaching toward sky, fit that cosmology precisely. The Osage were removed through treaties beginning in 1808 and ending with their final removal to Indian Territory in the 1870s. When they left, they took knowledge of this landscape that had been accumulating for generations, including an understanding of what inhabited the deep hollows and cave systems that the settlers who replaced them would spend the next century and a half avoiding without knowing why. Vance Randolph, the folklorist who spent decades collecting Ozark oral traditions in the early 20th century, documented accounts from hill communities across southern Missouri describing creatures in the deep woods that did not match any known species. What people told him, consistently, across communities with no contact with each other, was that there were things in the hollows that walked upright, that were larger than a man, and that the old families knew to leave alone. The people he interviewed were not forthcoming. They changed the subject. They said there were stories they did not tell outsiders. That reticence matches the pattern Linda Godfrey documented across the Great Lakes, where long-established rural families responded to questions about upright canine beings with quiet acknowledgement and firm boundaries about what they were willing to share. The dogman phenomenon in the Ozarks has received less attention than the Great Lakes corridor that Godfrey documented, or the Pacific Northwest accounts that have emerged over the past decade, but the reports are there, scattered across Missouri and Arkansas, concentrated in the most remote and rugged sections of the Ozark Plateau, and consistent in their descriptions. Large, canine-headed, bipedal, nocturnal, associated with ridgelines, caves, and areas with minimal human traffic. When Steve Cook wrote the legend in 1987 as an April Fool's prank at a radio station in Traverse City, Michigan, and then spent decades collecting reports from people who recognized what the song described, he was documenting a phenomenon that extended far beyond the Great Lakes. Reports came in from Missouri, from Arkansas, from places deep in the Ozarks where the terrain and the isolation and the depth of the forests matched what witnesses in Michigan and Wisconsin had described. The consistency across independent witnesses separated by decades and thousands of miles is the same pattern that Godfrey found, and that continues to emerge as more witnesses break their silence. The viburnum trend sits in the heart of this geography, running through some of the most remote, most geologically complex terrain in the Ozarks. The mine shafts go down 1,200 feet. The caves go deeper. Missouri's 6,000 documented caves are a fraction of what exists. The karst bedrock is porous, riddled with unmapped passages and connected systems that surface geology cannot predict. Anything that can navigate in darkness could use those subsurface corridors the way a highway system connects cities on the surface, invisible and below the reach of any survey technology deployed. In March of 2023, the company authorized the Phase 2 drilling program. The Forest Service requires environmental assessments before allowing drilling on national forest land, and the permit process included a biological survey conducted by a contracted firm out of Springfield. The survey biologist came off the north slope on the second day and told Merle something she framed as an observation. The north slope was unusually devoid of wildlife sign. Species diversity was significantly lower than comparable habitat on the south side. No turkey scratching, no bear scat, 0 active raptor nests. She She said the data was not outside the range of natural variation, and she would not flag it in her assessment, but she found it noteworthy. Then she asked Merle whether the company had any explanation for the low wildlife density. Merle told her the company had not conducted previous work on the north side, which was true. He did not tell her about the thermal data, the tracks, the vocalizations, or the sighting. He stood there and let a wildlife biologist walk off that ridge without the information she needed to understand why the forest was empty. That moment bothered him more than the sighting itself, because he was a professional making a calculated decision to withhold evidence from another professional whose job was to assess exactly the kind of biological presence he was concealing. He was participating in the institutional silence, and he was doing it for the same reason every other professional in this field does it: career preservation. The drilling program launched in April. A crew of 8 mobilized with 2 core rigs, support vehicles, and a temporary camp. Merle supervised setup and then turned site management over to a drilling foreman. His contract role was finished. But he went back on his own time through the spring and summer of 2023, hiking the ridgeline with a personal thermal unit, checking marked trees, looking for tracks in creek bottoms where rain softened the clay. The drilling operation was loud and constant, diesel generators running around the clock, the kind of activity that pushes every large animal out of an area within the first day. Whatever was on the north side did something different. It retreated, but not far. Merle found fresh tracks in a creek bottom 1.5 miles from the drill sites, still within the territory he had mapped. He found more marked trees deeper into the hollow, fresh gouges along what appeared to be a trail running along the contour of the slope. The creatures had not left. They had adjusted their range to maintain distance from the noise while staying on their ground. In June, one of the drillers reported something to the foreman that the foreman relayed to Merle casually as a bear encounter anecdote. The driller had stepped away from the rig at night to use the portable toilet at the edge of the clearing. He heard heavy movement in the timber, assumed a bear, yelled and banged on the toilet wall. When he shined his headlamp into the trees, he caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at him from a height above his own head. He was 6 feet tall. The eyes were higher. He went back to the drill platform and told his shift partner he was not leaving the lit area for the rest of the night. He did not say what he saw. He said it was a bear. The height of those reflected eyes matched everything Merle had been documenting. The creatures were monitoring the drilling operation and getting close enough to be encountered by crew members who had no idea what they were looking at. The drilling program ran through September of 2023. The core samples confirmed what the magnetometer survey had suggested: ore-grade lead and zinc at depth, consistent with the viburnum trend. Plans were discussed for a Phase 3 assessment that would include permitting for a potential mine development. A mine on the north side would mean permanent infrastructure, roads, shaft construction, ore processing, decades of industrial activity in the hollows where Merle had found tracks and marked trees and thermal signatures. During those months, Merle documented something about the creature's response to the drilling that stayed with him. They did not simply avoid the drill sites. They repositioned systematically. When the first rig began operating at the northern drill target, Merle found fresh tracks and territorial marks clustered to the northeast, away from the noise. When the second rig started at the southern target 2 weeks later, the activity shifted again, this time northwest, as if the creatures were reading the pattern of human expansion across their territory and calculating which sections remained undisturbed. They were not fleeing. They were managing their space the way a landowner manages an encroachment, yielding ground strategically while maintaining overall control of the property. That kind of spatial reasoning, the ability to assess an expanding human footprint and adjust territorial use in real time, goes beyond anything in the behavioral literature for known predators in North America. In October of 2023, almost exactly a year after the original survey, Merle submitted a document to the company that he had been writing and rewriting for months. It was not a geological report. It was a separate memorandum addressed to the Vice President of Exploration, describing in detail every non-geological observation from the October 2022 survey and his subsequent monitoring through 2023. The tracks, the vocalizations, the thermal data showing multiple large bipedal heat signatures, the sighting on the north slope, the marked trees with claw gouges reaching over 7 feet, the driller's encounter with eyes shine above human head height, the biologist's observation about the absence of wildlife. He included photographs, thermal images, GPS coordinates, and timestamps. He spent 2 weeks choosing every word in that document, stripping out anything that sounded speculative, anything that could be dismissed as subjective impression, leaving only the measurements in the images and the data points that spoke for themselves. He framed the document in the most careful professional language he could manage, describing the observations as evidence of an unidentified large predator species occupying the survey area and recommending a formal wildlife assessment before any further development activity on the north side of the ridge. He printed it, signed it, and mailed a hard copy to the St. Louis office, along with a USB drive containing the thermal files and photographs. He kept a duplicate of everything. The response came 3 weeks later from the company's head of operations and legal counsel in a joint call. Merle was told the memorandum had been reviewed, that the company did not consider the observations relevant, and that the document would be filed internally and not shared with the Forest Service, the Missouri Department of Conservation, or any regulatory body. He was told, in language that was polite and unmistakable, that his continued value to the company depended on his continued focus on geological work. Merle asked whether the company had ever received similar reports from other survey crews along the Viburnum Trend. The line went quiet. Then the head of operations said that the company's field operations generated a wide range of incidental observations and that managing those observations was an internal matter. He did not say no. That non-answer is the piece of evidence Merle carries with him more heavily than any track, photograph, or thermal image. The company did not deny that other crews had reported similar things. It declined to discuss it, which means the reports exist. Somewhere in the company's files, there are other memoranda from survey crews working remote sections of the trend, and the company has no intention of acknowledging them because doing so would threaten the leases, the permits, and the entire financial architecture of a mining operation. The institutional silence is not conspiracy, it is architecture. The Biological Survey looks for species the regulatory framework recognizes. The species list does not include an undocumented bipedal canid. Therefore, the creature does not exist in any document any regulatory agency will ever see. The Forest Service issues permits based on the assessment. The assessment is based on the survey. The survey is limited by its methodology. Nobody is lying. The system is functioning as designed. It was not designed to detect what is living on the north side of that ridge. Merle's contract was not renewed in 2024. No explanation was given. The calls stopped coming. Projects he had been promised went to other survey leads. He picked up smaller jobs, soil surveys, and environmental baselines for county projects. Work that kept the bills paid but bore no resemblance to the deep geological exploration he had built his career on. A man who had spent the better part of 2 decades walking the most remote terrain in the Ozarks with a magnetometer and a GPS was now surveying road shoulders and drainage easements in town. His colleagues from Rolla, friends he had known since college, asked him over beers what happened with the mining firm. He told them the contract ended. He did not tell them why. He could not tell them why without becoming the geologist who saw a dogman, and in the tight professional world of Missouri mineral exploration, that label would follow him for the rest of his career. Doyle told him the rest. The company had sent a second survey crew to the north side in January of 2024, a crew Merle had not been told about and had not been asked to lead. The company had gone around him, hired people who did not know the terrain or the history, and sent them up the ridge without context. Doyle heard through the local network that the crew came back after 2 days and refused to return. He did not know who was on the crew or what specifically they encountered. He just knew they went up, came back fast, and that the company had not sent anyone since. Whatever those men found on the north slope in January, in the cold and the bare canopy in the short winter days, was enough to confirm what Merle's memorandum had described and what the company's conference call had dismissed. The ridge is still there. The mineral rights are still held. The core samples from the 2023 drilling sit in a warehouse in St. Louis, showing ore-grade lead and zinc at 1,200 feet. The deposit is real and valuable, but the company has not filed for Phase 3 permitting. The drill sites on the north side have not been reclaimed, and the Forest Service has not asked why. The logging trace that Doyle cleared is growing over. Sumac and cedar and sassafras pushing up through the gravel, reclaiming the ground the way the Ozark forest reclaims everything humans abandon. The drill pads are already hard to find under the brush. In another 5 years, the forest will have erased every trace of the operation, and the only evidence that anyone was ever there will be the core samples in a warehouse and the thermal images on a hard drive in a house outside Salem. Merle drove out to the ridge one more time, in September of 2024. He hiked to the ridgeline and stood there looking down at the north slope. The marked trees were still visible through his binoculars, more of them now. He counted 12, a line of territorial markers along the upper contour, defining a boundary the company's surveys had crossed, and its personnel had apparently decided not to cross again. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. Something intelligent lived on that ridge, something that understood human activity well enough to monitor it, assess it, and make its position clear through signals that were impossible to misread. The marked trees, the vocalizations, the controlled distance, the willingness to show itself and then let the humans leave. Every interaction followed the same pattern that researchers have documented in dogman encounters across the continent. Warning, observation, boundary enforcement, and the consistent, deliberate choice to let the humans go. Merle's marriage strained during 2023. His wife could see the change. The late nights at his desk. The weekend drives to the ridge that produced no income. He tried to tell her once, sitting at the kitchen table after the kids were asleep. He showed her the thermal images. He watched her face go from concern to confusion to something that looked like fear. And the fear was not of the creature. It was for him. She thought the loss of the contract was affecting his mind. She told him she loved him and that maybe he should talk to someone. He closed the laptop and did not bring it up again. The distance between what he knew and what the people around him could accept was the same distance that every credible witness confronts eventually. Merle crossed it alone, the way hundreds of witnesses before him have crossed it, carrying evidence that would change the conversation if anyone in authority was willing to look at it. Doyle told Merle something in their last phone conversation. The old families in Reynolds County, the ones who had been on that ground since the 1840s and 50s, had an understanding with whatever lived in the deep hollows. You do not go where they live, and they do not come where you live. The boundary was not on a map. It was knowledge passed down through generations of people who learned which parts of the forest you stayed out of after dark. The mining company violated that boundary without knowing it existed. The Osage, who knew this country for centuries before the settlers arrived, took that knowledge with them when they were removed. The settler families who replaced them picked up fragments over time, through encounters they did not discuss, and embedded those fragments in the local culture as warnings and place names. Ridgewalkers, that was Doyle's mother's word, a word describing something real that lived in the real forest on the real ridge above real hollows, a way of telling your children where the world ended and something else began. The mineral rights are worth tens of millions of dollars. The domestic mineral supply chain has become a national security concern, and the federal government has signaled through lease renewals that continued production in the Mark Twain National Forest is a strategic priority. Against that pressure, there is a ridge in Reynolds County that the company's own survey crews will not cross. There is a question at the center of every dogman encounter that involves institutional knowledge. What happens when the development eventually moves forward? The creatures responded to a 10-day survey with surveillance. They responded to a drilling program with distance and boundary maintenance. What happens when the response is a permanent mine? When the generators run 24 hours a day for 20 years and the hollows fill with noise and activity that does not leave? Nobody knows. The research does not exist because the species does not officially exist. The institutions that could study it will not, because studying it would require acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would trigger consequences that the mining industry, the Forest Service, and the state of Missouri are not willing to absorb. The evidence is in Merle's home office in Salem. Thermal imagery, track photographs, GPS-tagged field notes, spanning over 2 years. A wildlife biologist with the right credentials could walk that ridge and within a week have data that would make the company's contracted environmental assessment look like a paragraph torn from a longer book. Nobody is going to do that. The Missouri Department of Conservation has no protocol for investigating reports of dogman activity on state or federal land. The Forest Service has no procedure for a predator not on any species list. The mining company has no incentive to fund a survey whose results could block development worth millions, and Merle has no standing to demand action on evidence institutions would rather not see. The system did not reject his evidence because it was weak. The system has no category for it, and creating one would require admitting the old categories were incomplete. which would unravel the regulatory framework that allows mining on national forest land without accounting for a dogman presence that no one in the chain is willing to put on paper. The north side of the ridge is quiet now. The drill sites are growing over, the logging traces narrowing as the forest pushes in from both sides. The marked trees stand along the upper contour of the slope, their gouges deepening as weather works the exposed wood. The caves at the base of the limestone ledges open into darkness that nobody has mapped and nobody intends to map. The ore sits at 1,200 feet, patient in the Bonneterre dolomite, waiting for someone to come get it. And above the ore, in the hollows and the caves and the ridgeline timber, something moves at night that was here before the Osage arrived and will be here after the last mine shaft floods and the last drill rig rusts. They have been on this ground through every version of this country, through the Osage and the settlers and the loggers and the miners, moving along corridors that predate human maps, marking boundaries that no survey has ever recorded, holding territory that no deed of mineral rights can reach, because it belongs to a claim filed in a language older than property law and enforced by a presence that the Ozark families understood for generations, and that the mining industry is learning to respect the only way the mining industry learns anything, which is by the things it cannot do. Merle still drives past that section of Route 72 when he is heading to Ellington. He looks north toward the ridgeline when he passes, the way you look at a place that changed you. He does not stop. The evidence is on his hard drive. The ridge is above the highway, and the distance between what he knows and what the world is willing to hear is not measured in miles but in the gap between what the forms can hold and what the land actually contains.